Hi. I wanted to say thank you so much to the administration and the art department at UNT, and for Laura particularly for bringing me here. I've been able to visit here a couple times, and it's always such a wonderful experience. So thank you very much. So let's see. Do I advance it like that? Yep. So I like to start out with something very personal. So these are my friends, my buddies. This is us having a show. I also think if you show your pet right at the beginning, it kind of builds, a community. So at least if you don't like me, you'll like my pet. That's my cat, Nellie. I've been working on calligraphy, so this is a little calligraphy piece I did, and that's my daughter, Carmen, who's graduating from college this year. So that's kind of a little bit about me personally. This is where I teach. The top, that red building, is the art department at Eastern Illinois University. This is how it looks for about 300 miles in any direction from where I teach. And that's a little map. And we have great students. It's a small school. We have about 120 students in the art department. And, it's automatically advancing. But anyway, we take them to different field trips, and we have a great time. So that's the art association there. I have had the pleasure of going to Bali and Java, Indonesia a couple times. And the most recent time, I took a group of students where we studied batik and ikat and basket making, and we got to work with local artisans, and it was a really great trip. And in fact, one of the fiber students, Abby Hudson, Abby Hudson was able to come along with us, and she was a student here at UNT. So if you want to go to Indonesia, see me after this, and I'll let you know when we're going, and you can come along next time. It was really a blast. This is my undergraduate professor, Tom Lundberg. And so when you're in college, you get influenced by the people that you work with, and oftentimes if you find somebody that you really connect with, they can serve as a mentor for you. So that was one of the things that Tom Lundberg did for me. He made these tiny little embroidered narrative imagery, like patches, and the care and the craftsmanship that he put into those works, I was really moved and impressed by. My other teacher that I started working with in graduate school was Carol Shaw Sutton, and she taught me this technique called twining, which is a basket making technique. It's the kind of main technique that I do. And she was super influential to me, both in techniques that she taught me, but also in ideas and how to think about art making. And these are some different works of hers. I wanted to say also, rather than me talking and then you asking questions later, if you happen to have a question in the middle, just raise your hand or call it out. And it's more fun if you can ask the question right when you're thinking about it. So I don't mind at all if you interrupt or chime in at any point. I just think it's more enjoyable for everybody. How many of you guys have Pinterest boards? So I'm a huge advocate of Pinterest. These are a couple of my Pinterest pages. If you don't have Pinterest, get going on it. I had friends in college that said, that would say, oh, I have this filing cabinet of images and all these files of pictures of frogs and another file of hands and another one of hair. And I was so jealous because it was like, oh, I want to have pictures of all the things I'm interested in. And yet I didn't have that kind of organizational sensibility, or I didn't do it that way back in the analog days. But now I have Pinterest. And so I have my own visual catalog of images, and it's just a great resource. So I strongly advocate kind of visual thinking in this way and collecting images and resources that can lead you to discover other things. So I had half of my education was in a fibers department, and half for undergrad, and then graduate school was in sculpture. So I had these two really wonderful experiences, although quite different. The fibers taught me the techniques and processes that I was interested in. And these are some of the fiber artists that I love. Magdalena Abakanowicz at the top here. She was one of the very first fiber people I got exposed to, and she's kind of one of the grandmothers of the fibers art movement. And Joan Livingstone, who does felt making in Chicago, Jennifer Heller Zurich, a more functional but and traditional basket making techniques, and then I had already mentioned Carol. And then I'm also really interested in sculpture. And to me, the kind of conceptual and expressive potential that sculpture offers, I really became interested in not wanting to work as a functional fiber person, but entirely trying to convey ideas and communicate meaning through my work. Because ultimately, art is a language, and I think as artists, the visual culture and visual language in our world today is a predominant way that people communicate and think. And we as artists, that is our domain, that is our expertise. And so as artists, you need to hone your ability to how you're going to think and speak visually, and how you can communicate through that realm. So it's a really incredibly important role that artists play in today's visual culture. One of the things that I love about textiles is how timeless they really feel and how old they are. So archaeologists have unearthed fabric and rope fragments dating back as far as 12,000 years. And it's interesting to me to work in a process that is that many, you know, it's like Neolithic man and women did these kind of processes thousands and thousands of years ago. So, and at that time it was a very functional outcome, but also aesthetic. And now to be able to adapt that into a more contemporary practice, I think is a really exciting way to work. Let's see. Okay. So more recently, there was a number of artifacts unearthed in Oregon, and one of these was this 10,000-year-old sandal. And that's exactly, part of that sandal is exactly the technique that I do in my art making. So to me, being connected with objects that are, and processes that are so old is a really kind of compelling way to participate in art making. Also, the other thing about fibers that I find is different than most other processes is the viewer has an innate kind of connection to fibers. We're all wearing fabric things right now, sitting on a padded, maybe not so padded, but sitting on upholstered furniture. We sleep surrounded by fibers. We are standing, our feet are right now connected to a floor that's covered in fiber. We have a different connection to that than other sort of high-end art-making materials. And so I think that whether we're conscious of it or not, we have an avenue into the material itself and how the material carries meaning. So even though it comes out of a domestic sphere, using it as an art-making material, I think is a way to bring the viewer into that language that I'm trying to use. So here's all three of these actually are twined examples, and the technique like I said, I do is twining. One of the other interesting things to me, twining is a technique where it's basically spokes and weavers. So it's kind of like a loom, it's an off-loom technique, but it's sort of like a loom. So the spokes are a vertical element, and the weavers just go in between those spokes. And it's basically two figure eights that go alternate in between those spokes, okay? And because it's a fairly simple structure, it was developed in many places across the globe simultaneously. It was one of the archaeological simultaneous inventions that happened about 11,000 years ago, which is so kind of interesting to me. We're jumping forward a little bit here to 1970s and the pop art movement, and this artist, Ed Rossbach, took the ideas of traditional basketry and brought them into the 20th century. And although this might look sort of mundane and, I don't know, something like maybe you've seen before, back at this time in the 1970s, to make such sort of a decorative object with a pop cultural icon on a basket was very unusual and kind of revolutionary in its own way. So that was a big shift in thinking about how basketry specifically could be an art object and not just an object to carry strawberries home from the store. Other artists like Eva Hess, she was an early sculptor, and I don't even know if she perceived of herself as a fiber artist, but she worked with materials like latex and rope and alternative processes at a time when galleries and museums were willing to exhibit this stuff as art. So prior to this time, sculpture that was in museums and galleries was made of stone, it was made of wood, it was made of metal, like poured bronze. But during the 60s and 70s, there was a kind of the women's movement and the craft movement, and galleries and museums became willing to include alternative materials and processes. And it really opened the door to all this kind of creative thinking that people were doing at that time. Now we're jumping right to my work. So I have a quick little video clip so that you can see sort of how this process is done. So let me click on this and see if it goes. It's only 20 seconds long, so it's kind of repetitive, but it's only, or 30 seconds. So as you can see, I talked about the spokes and then the paired weaver that moves between those spokes. So this is how, one stitch at a time, this process evolves. And I like to show this because some people think that I buy kind of fabric and then sort of form it into shapes, but really it's sculpted as it's being made. So if I add more spokes, this is my daughter playing the drums in a band, as I add more spokes, we'll come back to that. As I add more spokes, the object gets wider, and as I take them away, it gets narrower. Okay, so it's pretty simple. This is a piece I did called Unloved. And because I was working with a sort of traditional domestic object making, I had to think, how am I going to make that not look like a basket you put grapes in, but make it look like a sculpture? And so I thought, well, I could, instead of having an opening, I could have it woven shut. Instead of having a big opening, I could have a teeny tiny opening. Instead of having an opening that points up, I could have the opening point down. Or like in this case, instead of having any opening at all, I fill the opening with stones. And so this piece is called Unloved, and it was about this character I read about in a book that was described as being unloved, which I thought was, you know, like the saddest thing ever. And I chose to display this, not like it looks like here, but it was in a room, a kind of a small room that overlooked the Lake Michigan in Chicago. And there was this giant window, and in front of the window, because it was a display space, they had built a wall. And so the wall really blocked the window, but you could go around the wall and look out the window if you felt like it. So what I did with this piece is I put the feet sort of as though they were standing against the wall. So you could imagine yourself taking the place of those feet and standing against this flat wall, which was blocking your view of this beautiful scene behind the wall. So it was like a metaphor for the feeling of being unloved, if that makes any sense. Which is always really weird to come and talk to you about art making, because really I go in my studio. If I wasn't here today, well, let's see, it's Wednesday, I'd be teaching, but on Thursdays and Fridays and over the weekend, I'd be in my studio making things. And so it's really fun and interesting and different to come out and try to put these visual things that I've made into words for you. I don't really expect, like when you walk up, if you were to walk up and see this piece, I wouldn't really expect you to say, oh, she was probably thinking this, 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 and this. Probably not, right? So, but because I'm here, I'm sharing sort of the backstory with you on some of the work. I often work with the human body because we all have one, and I think that it's a way that we can connect once again with the work. So you can imagine the gesture of holding your hands like this. This piece is called Offering, and so it's about that idea of giving. And so this is an older piece, but I wanted to include it because it relates to some newer work that I've been doing. This is a piece called Merging, and on the other, if you were able to see on the left, there was a giant wall of windows and a garden. And so I made these bird-like shapes that hung sort of inert and flightless. And so it was sort of a sad piece, really. It was called 44 Blackbirds. And then, so on one side of the wall were these birds, and if you crossed through the wall, so if you walked around that wall to the other side, were 44 birds in this piece called Letting Go. And so it was as though the birds went, in my head, through the wall and could fly away, right? So kind of an afterlife for them. And you can't really see these as birds, so I started making this work, not intentionally, that was so hard to photograph. It was clear string coming out of a white wall. So it looks like this. It's like, what even is that slide that she's showing us? And so anyway, here's a closer view and yet a closer one. So what I did was I made hundreds of holes in the silhouette shape of each bird and then inserted this super thick monofilament in it called Omniflex. And so it made these almost like invisible shapes, but then the shadows sort of brought them to life. And I have a little action shot here. This is your professor, Laura Beard, who was helping me install. So a lot of times I do these projects. Here she is drilling, and then here I had a team of people inserting this string into these shapes. So a lot of times I have help doing these larger installation projects. Do you guys know what installation is? Yeah? Good. This is another piece that was at that show called Absence, I think it was. And it was the first net piece I ever did. So prior to this, I was making a bunch of work that was these solid sort of shapes. And I wanted something that was more open and airy and transparent in contrast to these heavier, more solid, massive shapes. And so I took a piece of string and I taped it in the shape of a person on my table. And then I just started tying knots in every direction until it became this 8-foot by 10-foot net with the hole in the middle of the net being this person. And I know there are better ways that like fishermen tie knots, but I figured, you know what? We've all tied shoes before. We know how to tie a knot, and I wanted to try it, and then later learned the way nets are really made, which is actually a lot simpler and faster. But sometimes I think you just have to, if you have an idea, just go for it. Just try to figure it out as best you can. I often also work, so I work a lot with the human body. Another group of ideas that I kick around a lot is ideas about nature. And so, and this was about the idea of biological processes sort of infiltrating our non-biological world. So I was thinking of this as though a tree could grow right through the gallery wall and, you know, into the gallery space, as though there were a tree outside that was moving into our space. And so this is all these tiny little tips of branches poking through the wall, and there's a closer view. It was really a very simple idea, but kind of quiet and interesting to me. It was called Merging, as though those two spaces could merge together. And again, with working with ideas about nature, I did these 2 tornado pieces, which were made of netting once again. And the netting was sort of boring after I got done with it, so I decided to tie a little tiny white string to every corner of where the netting intersected, so that as you walked by, it just kind of had this slight sort of movement to the piece that I found provocative. And right in the middle of making these nets, I took a vacation. And on the vacation, I was at the Gulf, kind of near here. Anyway, I was at the Gulf of Mexico, and this water spout came out of the sky. Like in the distance, it was sunny where I was, but in the distance, this water spout came out of the sky, and it was the most amazing thing. Have you guys, anybody ever seen one of these? It's like this line that comes out of the sky and into the water, and then the whole thing kind of dances. It's a tornado on the water, is what it is. And I was watching it thinking, God, that is just the coolest thing. And the way it moves, and you could see there was sort of water going up and down this tube. And then after I watched it a while, a second one dropped out of the sky right next to it. And so I thought, oh, you know, I was in the middle of making this tornado piece. And so I decided, well, I have to make a second then tornado piece. So that I made that smaller one in the back there to kind of give a sense of receding space. Later, I went into town and I found, and I for some reason I had it in my head that water spouts aren't really that dangerous. That if they hit land, they just dissipate. And then this man at this maritime museum said, "Oh no, actually, it becomes a tornado, and we're in terrible danger. So don't ever do that again." So if you've got to see a water spout, do all the things you would for a tornado. So here you can see up close how the strings looked at the intersections. And this is that show overall. There was some other pieces in the back there called Dark Clouds, again with the idea of nature having the ability to just sort of permeate through the gallery space and become these sort of dark cloud shapes, you know, floating in the gallery. And this is a show called Endless Sky, and when I was a child, I was really, really terrified of looking into the night sky because I associated it with the idea of infinity, and to me, infinity was like so big of an idea, I just couldn't even handle it. And so when we would drive, you know, to grandma's or something at night, I would have to kind of go like this. I couldn't look out the windshield if it was nighttime, and it really frightened me and made a kind of a profound imprint on me. So one of the thoughts for this particular exhibition I had was Endless Sky. And so all the pieces dealt with sky in a different way. So you could see the tornado piece and the clouds piece kind of reappearing here, because I realized I was making sort of natural phenomenon sky objects. This was called Feather Cloud or something like that. And it was literally a cloud made of feathers. And it was about maybe that big. And again, I don't know, I had this idea how that would move and how that would look. Yeah?
Do you make these before you go into the museum, or you make them while you're in there?
Most, I make them always ahead of time, and then, but sometimes like when I made this, I took, I think it was 2,000 or maybe more feathers, and I tied a little string to the feather, and then I tied a little string to a pin, and the same string, and then I had to figure out how am I going to transport these without them becoming a giant tangled mess. So I measured out little pieces of wax paper, and I taped 10 on each sheet, and then I had all these sheets of wax paper with all these pins, and then I'd never actually pinned it to the wall, so I'd never really seen it. It was kind of existed in here, and then it manifest when you got to the gallery space.
How long did that take for you to put all that together?
To pin it to the wall, or to tie the strings on the feathers?
Well, you can both.
The tying the strings on the feathers, if you have ever, and it's teeny tiny sewing thread, that took so long, I can't even tell you. And but I cannot, fibers is a thing. It's really, really great and really fun, and you should all take a fibers class. It takes some time, okay? Doing those one stitch at a time. All those processes, they build slowly, they build incrementally. Yeah?
Do you have a deadline, or were you kind of just working on those?
Well, I had the deadline of when the show was going to install, so I had to start it ahead enough, you know, in time ahead enough that I would have it ready to go. And then, but I have to kind of separate the idea that this takes time from the idea that I want to make this. I have to just go for it, and I'll just spend the time. What am I going to do instead, right? I don't have television anymore at my house because I tie strings on feathers, okay? But I listen to podcasts and, do Netflix sometimes. But the point is, you just have to decide how it is you want to spend your time, how it is what do you want to do with it? We all have a limited amount of time, right? And I actually feel kind of fortunate that I grew up at a time, so think about you in college, okay, that's you. Now think about me in college. Here's me in college. We had no television because it was invented, but, but there was no cable and none available, like in the dorms, no. So all the time that you take watching television, there were no computers, okay? No computers, no cell phones. So all the time, no game systems. So all the time you spend doing any of those things, add that all together, and now you know how I could tie thousands. I had all that time available to do other things. Now we messed around and didn't focus altogether, but we just had a lot more available time. And our social networking was face to face. Let's get together. And, so I kind of feel like you guys have a lot more distractions, so you have to be more disciplined if you want to get more done, frankly. And it's tough. I feel for you. I have students, I teach too, so I have students that, and we talk about it, and and you'll develop discipline. You'll develop your practice and how you can manage those things, I think. So yeah, a lot of times I have ideas for pieces and then I do them at home. Like this piece, I made these shapes, but I'd never hung them on the ceiling before. I'd never put them in the space before. And then when you get there, you just kind of figure it out. So I wanted to show you this because I loved the shadows, okay? I loved the shadows more than I loved the pieces, which was, I realized they looked even more like clouds to me in that. Don't you think? Yeah. And so sometimes that wasn't even something I'd expected, right? I had done that in my studio, but it wasn't until I had them in the space with light on them, and it's like, whoosh, this shadow goes across the wall, and it's like, ah, it's like this moment of, yay, I've got tingles talking about it. This was another piece from the Endless Sky show. So they were hung kind of high up so that as you stood there looking at it, you were doing what it was doing, which I thought was kind of an interesting idea. So you're like looking into the sky. So this combined, I think this might have been the first time I combined the twining with the netting into one piece. I think I'm going to move past a couple of these. This was a giant 20-foot-long boat shape I did that was outside for a year in this atrium space. It was really a neat space. It was this long, thin space where they said, do you want to hang something or put something in this space for a year? And I said, yes, because here's the answer. If you're ever asked, you need to be in the land of yes, okay? So can you make a chair for our thing? Yeah. I mean, I've never made a chair before, but you have to get into that habit as an artist, like, I can do that. I have this creative ability and I'll figure it out. And so just when I was in your position, I was in undergrad and I went to, I think it was the Saul Bass lecture at CSU, and this is what he said, just say yes. If anybody offers or wants you to do something artistically, yep, I'll do that. Anyway, so I said yes to this, and then I figured out how to make this sort of framework from which this net hung in this boat shape. And it was so beautiful when the wind or the snow fell on it, the rain, the ice on every little string, and it was just lovely. So it was an interesting thing to be able to do. So this is the piece that was on the poster. Sometimes, and I think this is a great idea for everyone, is I have this piece that I've been working on for years and years. It's called Mother Memory, and I started doing it with this woman in Turkey, and anyway, she stopped doing it long ago, but I kept doing this piece, and what it is kind of a group of little objects and that are sort of mini sculptures, and then I hang them all together. And over time, I probably have 40 or 50 of them now, and they're a great way, if I'm in between sort of larger works, to try things out, to play with different materials and processes. And you know, these are all centered around this idea of mother memory. So it's either something a child, like a thought of a mother and child, or an experience of being a child, or an experience of being a mother. Like, for example, the hand where it has the string tied around your finger. Do you know that, how like to remember something, your mom would tie a string around your finger? So it was like that kind of thing. So each one of these has some relationship of cradling or nurturing, or one thing inside of another, or something like that. Or like this, you know, how their mom always said, no, 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 no. Big jump. Okay, so I had this idea for 2012, which was the end of the Mayan calendar, and this kind of cataclysmic sort of end of the end of days is what they actually called it. And it really wasn't the end of the world, but that's another longer story. But it was really more of a unification and rebirth from what I read. But I wanted to make this giant flock of birds because in my mind, I remember thinking somewhere that, like, the idea that birds would rain down from the sky. Does this ring a bell to anybody? Like, even though I thought it was a biblical reference, it's not in the Bible. I don't know where it came from, but it's out there, and in kind of culture, urban legend probably. But and I also really started looking at flocks of birds and the way birds moved, like those murmurations of starlings that fly at Otmore, and you've seen the videos, right? Those giant, everybody's seen those. Have you seen them? Oh, if you haven't, look them up. And they move as one, and this idea that all these creatures could become a symbiotic whole, to me, was just this beautiful idea. So I wanted to make this flock of birds. Well, I've mentioned that the weaving process is a little time consuming. I wanted to make hundreds and hundreds, and so I decided to do slip cast ceramic. So I wove, so this is a group of 880. Doesn't it look like about 200? It's not, it's 880. So this is the process. I wove, let's see, there's another picture later, but I wove 10 different originals, and then I made molds. See, those are the molds up there. And so then I made molds from the 10 woven ones, and then you pour the liquid clay in, you count to 100, and then you pour it out, and a shell of the thin liquid clay remains inside the plaster. Wait 2 hours, pop it open, and then you have a shell of ceramic that in the shape of your original. And then you have to fix the seams and then fire it and a whole bunch of other stuff. But so there's the molds, then they were drying, and then here's after they've been fired. This was a big project. And then I don't know hardly anything about ceramics. I do now, but I didn't then. And I just decided to paint them with black gesso, which is a wonderful material.
Do you think a part of you was thinking of the movie Birds when you came up
The movie Birds?
with- Yeah.
You know, I don't know, but surely it's in there, because certainly everybody, you bring your own kind of scope of experience to any piece of art, right? So certainly a person could easily come to that piece and think of that Hitchcock movie, The Birds. For me, I'm not that into horror films, or, you know, I mean, I've seen it, and I always thought it, especially now, if you go back and see The Birds now, we're so used to CGI and this sort of perfect, it's kind of goofy, honestly. So it's kind of funny, I don't know, from a contemporary eye, but at the time, it was terrifying. I remember people saying, you know, how scared they were of birds after that. But I don't think that really entered into it for me. This is me adjusting them. This I could have done for a really long time. So I hung them up, and then I could move them up and down, well, up, not down. I could move them up from where they were and tie them shorter. So it was it was really a fun project. And it, like you were asking, did you know what it was going to look like? Holy cow, I did not. I had boxes of ceramic birds and this idea that they were going to hang from this ceiling that was 25 feet. It was not quite twice as high as this, but it was a really high ceiling. And anyway, it was a big project, but really fun. In the middle of doing those big projects, I also kind of do other smaller things, because I think if you're involved in a project that takes a year or whatever, a really long time, you need to have other smaller incremental goals that are attainable. So this was a piece I did called Sisters. I have 3 sisters, and it's about relationships, and these are about 8 feet tall, maybe, and again, a combination of the two. So 880 just wasn't quite enough, and so I made like 400 more, and this is over 1,200, because they asked, do you want to do this installation in this storefront? And I said, wow, that would be so great. It had this giant pole in the middle, which I said, no problem. Let's have them sort of fly in through the window and kind of wrap around the pole and then fly out the other side visually. And so, yeah, this was another kind of manifestation of that project. And I'm still kind of working on it, which I'll show you in a minute. This is a piece I did called Connect, about this person that I met that we became really connected and in a really beautiful way. So I made these 2 kind of hand forms that fit perfectly interlocking like this. So I still was interested in body things, even though I was kind of moved more toward nature things. And a couple years ago, I did this piece called Fingerprints when I turned 50, which is so weird to be like a half a century old. It's just a weird thought. Wait till you get there. So I made this group of 50 forms that are all different and sort of variations on a theme. And again, I really like to work with small multiple things, and it offers a lot. And I think they kind of read almost like words in a sentence, or I just like the way they dialogue with one another. This is them in a box, because after I packed them in a box to go to the show, I thought, wow, they just look great in a box. You can see the bubble wrap between it. It's like, that could just be a piece, just stuff in boxes. It'd be a really easy install. You just go and open the box, and people go from box to box. So after I did the other bird pieces, I decided to go for this commission, and it was perfect. In Illinois, we have the Percent for Arts and Architecture program, and so a certain percentage of the money for a building project is reserved to purchase artwork for that space. And I competed and received this huge commission, having never done a commission in my life. And so, but it was variation on the other bird piece I did after many iterations. But this time I wanted, because it was going to be permanent, I wanted them to be glazed with a permanent coating. So here you can see the process again. There's the woven bird, the molds. Here's putting the birds kind of together after they come out of the molds. And then this time I did a bisque fire, glazed them, and then fired them. But I designed these like a weaver would think about things, not like a ceramicist. So I made all these long, thin wings that were supposed to be attached to this little tiny body, and they kept breaking off, so we had to reinforce them, and it was this whole thing. But it worked, and we're getting ready to install it hopefully sometime soon. I'm going to move through a couple of these quickly. This is a piece I did, an installation of a group of the netted forms. Again, still working with the idea of nets and woven things together. This is the piece actually that's at the Denton Arts Council, I think is what it's called, in the Materials Hard and Soft show. And so it's called Heads, and it's about people and relationships and families and personalities and differences and samenesses in people. this is a recent body of work that I've been doing in the last year where I'm thinking about, well, honestly, I'm thinking about my daughter leaving. She went to school where I live at the University of Illinois, and now she's moving away. And it's just weird having a child and then you're with them so much for so much of their life, and then they leave. And it's just a strange transition. And so I'm thinking about that transition in this group of work. But it could be about any transition. It could be about any relationships. Like if you look at it and you have your best friend or your loved one, and so it could be about anything. For me, that's what it's about. This piece is called Tether, so there's like a foot with this long, thin string connected to this beautiful copper woven, random woven like ball. Or this one called Pull. Same idea, right? Can you see it? Can you see it? Like the feeling of pulling, like the child pulling on as you're dragging them through the grocery store. But that same kind of feeling and that wanting to be connected, and how are we connected with one another. So I did about 4 pieces within that series. This is a group of another slip cast ceramic piece I did last year called senescence. Senescence is the sciencey word for the cellular deterioration, it's kind of hard to say, cellular deterioration that happens as we age. That's called senescence. That's the kind of breakdown of cells. And so have you ever heard of the 1,000 cranes? How the Japanese fold 1,000 cranes in order to make a wish for like a good wedding or a baby, so which is kind of to me magical thinking. It's like the thought that what I do and make can affect something outside of me. So I had this idea that if I did this project, I could save this person who was having health concerns, and it worked. So there it is, proof. Magical thinking is real. So at one end of the 1,000, they were highly textured like this. And then as you walked by this wall, at the other end, they gradually got smoother and smoother till it became perfectly smooth at the other end. So it was like a baby becoming wrinkled, or like, I don't know, a rock becoming smoother as it tumbles in the waves, right? A change of time. How do we metaphorically show that? I wanted to show you this. This is a piece I recently did. Get your sketchbook, draw in your sketchbook, write in your sketchbook, sketch and sketch and sketch. Don't edit on the way in, edit on the way out. This is a sketch I did, and that was the piece. So I wanted to show you kind of how I think. And then I write, well, you can't see the words. Up there it says connect, tether, separate, something, attach, or something, maybe, I don't know, some other word. So that's just a sketch in my sketchbook and a piece called Attach. Thank you for listening to me. You were really attentive and nice people. Got a good vibe off you. Does anybody have any questions real quick? Oh, surely you must. You don't have to, really. It's a lot of information. Yes? I did that as a crazy person would have, and I wove it as one continuous thing. It was so silly. So the hard part was like I had to weave on the inside, so it went up and around like that. It was crazy. You must be a fiber person. Are you a fiber?
No, I just saw that they look really like connected.
It was woven as one thing. Yeah. It wasn't maybe the best way, but it worked. Did you have a question?
So when's your next trip to Bali?
My next trip to Bali, this is my partner that goes with me, probably 2 years from this summer. Come with us. So great. Talk to Abby Hudson. Talk to me after this. Any other questions? Yes? Most of the time, I think I have the idea fleshed out in my sketchbook, at least to some degree. Because in fibers, like this is the piece I'm working on now, and I will get to the end of these, and I could add more, but it works best in some of the fiber processes I do to have kind of an idea of what you're going to do at the onset. I have a few things down here too if anybody wants to take a quick look. I only brought what I could throw in my suitcase, but thank you so much.
Thank you, Anne.